Back in mid-September, I emailed all the alumni to introduce myself as this year's council chairperson. And in the message, I shared with our alumni community my thinking on what makes our HDS graduates so unbelievably unique. And I used 3 words to describe that. And that was values, vision, and action. And it, as I said, it kind of circled back to my time here with Nancy Richardson. For me, I wanted to live a life that included action. I didn't just want to talk about things. I wanted to be out there doing them too. And I believe that people come to HDS with this core restlessness. They have an idea, they have questions, they have a calling, and they work here to develop a vision that's rooted in those values that they bring and that they further develop here. And that leads to action out in the world for the good of others. So let me open up this dialogue and stop talking myself. Let me open up this dialogue by asking about that sense of restlessness. And was that true for both of you? And did you come here with an experience of restlessness? And how did it change over the course of your time here? And so, responses from Brinton and Jess.
Okay, ladies first in the South, where I grew up in New Orleans, Louisiana in the 1950s, and what my Northern Irish colleagues were later to tell me was a biracial family. That is, my mother was Catholic and my father was of Protestant descent. And by the time I was aware of such things, he was quite an agnostic. I'm the second child in a family of 9, and I grew up in a segregated city. As layers of institutional racism were beginning to be peeled away through the courageous organizing and actions of young black men and women and some rare white elders. Among those rare white elders was Archbishop John Francis Rummel, who had admitted 2 black students to Notre Dame Seminary a year before I was born, and who ordered the removal of white and colored signs from churches as early as 1951, and in 1953 issued his pastoral letter officially desegregating the entire Archdiocese of New Orleans. But that was not without huge resistance among those political leaders. As a white privileged child of parents who could send me to a private Catholic school, I might have missed these historic shifts beneath my feet had my cousins' parents not yanked them out of the private school that we all attended together, and had not Archbishop Rummel decided to excommunicate their grandfather because he organized boycotts against the Catholic Church and refused to desegregate Catholic schools in St. Bernard and Plaquemines Parish, where he was a local political leader. This polarizing issue played itself out on the national scene, costing lives throughout the South, and fractured my family in ways which I really did not understand at the time, and it would take me many years to piece that together. But despite this partial knowledge and understanding, racial injustice, enforcing my privileges as a white woman, and the marginalization and exclusion of blacks were models for direct and indirect resistance and struggle against injustices, and shaped my childhood and my adolescence. Equally important was that experience of white religious leadership. So those years took me to college and to Paris, which just coincidentally was 1968, where I was immersed in the study of medieval philosophy and theology and architecture as students and workers closed the university and then the city. That for me was an introduction to Marxist ideology and to the experiences of Karl Marx, but also the experiences of protesting on the streets. I met the worker priest movement there, the work of Simone Weil, and also took a pilgrimage from Paris to Chartres Cathedral. So despite being an outsider to these multiple ideologies, the political commitments unified us across them, and I became increasingly concerned about the deep inequities in our society, both in France and in the United States. I was in France when Martin Luther King was killed and when Robert Kennedy was assassinated. And when I returned to the US, I joined protests of the Vietnam War and volunteered in a Head Start program in rural Appalachia. All of these experiences and the continuing presence of religious people in my life led me, much to the consternation of my parents, to Harvard Divinity School. Because I sought to fuse my intellectual curiosities with the kind of activist involvement that I had seen around me since I was a very young child. Despite the fact that I had met T. Grace Atkinson when I was in college, most of you may not know who she is, but she was a lesbian separatist feminist who grew up in Louisiana. I had been appalled by her lesbian feminism and wanted to pursue the earlier Marxist ideology with which I was familiar. But it was here at Harvard Divinity School that I encountered marginalization and oppression and exclusion as a woman, and it was among women who entered the Divinity School in those years that I began to discover that despite the privileges that I had and the ways in which my economic and racial selves had privileged me, that I was being marginalized in a church and in a divinity school that I had sought to continue a struggle of learning more. I also encountered liberation theology, Don Helder Camara, Dorothy Day, Raimundo Panicar, and that nurtured a restlessness and put me into communication again with the international community. So for 40 years, it's a little shocking to the system to realize how long it's been. That restlessness has shifted in that I am no longer the young, sort of outspoken and radical self that I was in my 20s. I don't know whether that's good or that's bad. I've become, as Julia said, a university professor, and I seek to use the leverage that I have and the power that I have in those positions to continue in the paths that I had during my days at the Divinity School. I teach at an elite Catholic university here in the Boston area, but I've also worked in communities of war and in zones of armed conflict and in communities emerging from war. So we have many interests in common we've discovered through getting to know each other through this process. For me, one of the most significant political and social changes during these 40 years has been the diminishment, or some would say the disappearances, of the cross-community social movements in which I lived my youth and young to mid-adulthood. The journey during those years was deeply collective and deeply communitarian, and it often feels much more solitary today. Over these latter years, I have accompanied those who have deeply suffered, and I have been privileged to facilitate multiple processes through which they claim their power, name their strengths, and embrace languages and rituals that have often been repressed through colonial occupations. They take resources through which they have survived across generations of violence, and they move beyond survival to actions. Many have been silenced, tortured, displaced, and more, and yet practice what I have called in a recent article to be published later this year, people's psychosocial praxis. So for me, the challenge is continually to listen deeply and then to announce the arrival of new voices and to cede my power to their presence. These years have taught me there are no quick fixes, that real change is slow and extends over multiple lifetimes. And most days I'm okay with that, not every day. But I believe that our children's children will reap the fruits of the seeds that we sow today, and assuming that we don't destroy the earth and each other over these years, I look forward to their being able to nurture themselves into a world that is less unjust and more equitable. And I wish for all of you to be able to pursue your restlessness for another 40 years.
Yay.